Good evening and welcome to the Ann Arbor District Library on AADL TV. Thanks for tuning in for tonight's presentation of Exploring the Mind with the University of Michigan Department of Psychology. In just a moment, Dr. Christopher Monk will introduce our guest, Dr. Donna Nagata. To find past Exploring the Mind programs and to check out all of our virtual events, visit aadl.tv.
All right, thank you very much for joining us. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Donna Nagata. Dr. Nagata is a professor of psychology in the clinical psychology area here at the University of Michigan. She completed her undergraduate degree at the University of California, Berkeley, and then she went on to get her Ph.D. at the University of Illinois. So following her clinical internship at UCLA, Dr. Nagata joined the faculty of Smith College in Western Massachusetts. Then in 1992, she came here to Ann Arbor to join us at the University of Michigan. Dr. Nagata's research interests focus primarily on Asian American mental health. Specific topics of interest for her are Japanese Americans and the psychosocial consequences of World War II incarceration and historical trauma, Asian American family processes, as well as intergenerational relations. Dr. Nagata's talk is entitled Intergenerational Impacts of the World War II Japanese American Incarceration. Here is Dr. Donna Nagata.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, Chris. And thank you as well to the Ann Arbor District Library for hosting this talk. I appreciate the opportunity to present on the World War II Japanese American incarceration from a psychosocial perspective. Although World War II took place over 75 years ago, I'll be describing its extended impacts on Japanese Americans that continue to unfold long after the war ended. If I were to describe this talk and the theme in 2 words, the words would be history matters. I know that seems obvious. Of course, history matters. Historic events change societies and lives in clearly significant ways. From a psychologist's perspective, however, what I hope to show is that one important reason why history matters is that while historical events are linked to specific dates in our past, they often have rippling psychosocial impacts that extend well beyond chronological time. These impacts reach across an individual's life, across generations, and in a range of ways that are not always obvious. To illustrate this, I'll focus on one specific historical event and address the question: what have been the long-term impacts of the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans in the US? Before I begin, I want to take a moment to clarify my terminology for this talk. Most often, the World War II imprisonment of Japanese Americans is referred to as the internment. However, here I use the term incarceration, following the current recommendations of the Densho Encyclopedia. Densho is an online nonprofit focused on preserving and sharing the history of the Japanese American incarceration. The recommendations note that the term internment should be used to refer to the legally permissible detention of enemy aliens and not to refer to the mass forced removal and imprisonment of Japanese Americans, most of whom were US citizens. The latter is more appropriately termed an incarceration. It's important to first provide some background historical information around the incarceration event itself before talking about long-term consequences. As you probably know, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese military attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, killing more than 2,400 and wounding more than 1,100 Americans, catapulting the US into World War II. Within 24 hours, the FBI quickly arrested some 1,500 immigrant Japanese community leaders whom they considered to be high risk. These individuals, which included Buddhist priests and teachers, were abruptly taken from their homes and sent to alien internment camps without any evidence of wrongdoing, leaving their families with no information about their fate or their destination. Soon after, on February 19th, 1942, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, authorizing the military to remove all persons of Japanese ancestry from the west coast of the US mainland and into parts of Arizona. What was the rationale? Well, the rationale was that no one with Japanese blood could be trusted, and those living close to the Pacific Ocean in proximity to Japan were especially likely to be spies or saboteurs working with the Japanese Empire. The mass removal was presented as a military necessity, moving people away from the coast because they were potential spies and disloyal. In the week before the issuance of the removal, Lieutenant General John DeWitt, then the leader of the Western Defense Command, described the military necessity as follows in his report to the Secretary of War. In the war in which we are now engaged, racial affinities are not severed by migration. The Japanese race is an enemy race, and while many second and third generation Japanese born on United States soil, possessed of United States citizenship, have become quote unquote Americanized, the racial strains are undiluted. That Japan is allied with Germany and Italy in the struggle is no ground for assuming that any Japanese, barred from assimilation by convention as he is, though born and raised in the United States, will not turn against this nation when the final test of loyalty comes. It is, therefore, follows that along the Pacific coast, over 112,000 potential enemies of Japanese extraction are at large today. There are indications that these are organized and ready for concerted action at a favorable opportunity. The very fact that no sabotage has taken place to date is disturbing and confirming indication that such action will be taken. However, it's important to note that there was no evidence of organized pro-Japanese activity, and there was no mass incarceration of Japanese in Hawaii, the site of Pearl Harbor, which was much closer to Japan. Additionally, investigations into the risks posed by Japanese Americans, including assessments by the FBI and the intelligence chief of the Southern California Naval District, did not see mass evacuation as warranted. They concluded there was no Japanese problem. All of this information was ignored and the push for removal was implemented. As you can imagine, anti-Japanese sentiments were running very high, and with that came public and political pressure to do something. These news clippings exemplify the times. What was the scope of Executive Order 9066 and who was affected? It affected 120,000 Japanese Americans, from infants to the elderly. This was 90% of mainland Japanese Americans at the time. 2/3 were US citizens born in America, most of whom were adolescents or young adults. And the orders also applied to orphans and anyone up to 1/16 Japanese blood. The average length of time spent in camp was 2 to 3 years. The mass removal began by the spring of 1942. Posters instructed all persons of Japanese ancestry living within designated areas to report for evacuation. Most had less than 2 weeks' notice. They were told to take only what they could carry and were forced to leave behind homes, land, businesses, non-Japanese friends and neighbors, and family pets. Cars, appliances, and household belongings had to be abandoned or sold for a pittance. No one knew where they were being taken or for how long. And although some non-Japanese individuals and organizations stored people's belongings for safekeeping during the war and kept their promise, others sold them for personal profit or abandoned them. This is a photo showing people waiting for their evacuation in San Francisco in April of 1942. And as shown here, each family was assigned an impersonal number and tagged for removal. Many people don't realize that most Japanese Americans actually went through 2 separate dislocations, The first was being removed from their homes to temporary detention facilities. The reason for this was that the public pressure led the government to act quickly in removing Japanese Americans from their communities before the camps were actually ready. As a result, they were first taken to what were euphemistically called assembly centers, most of which were located at racetracks and fairgrounds. There they lived in quickly converted horse stalls and livestock facilities or temporary barracks for an average of 2 to 3 months. These photos show the Santa Anita racetrack in California, which was converted into one of these temporary detention centers. It held over 8,500 people. The photo on the left, as described in the caption, shows workers converting horse stalls into housing. And the one on the right shows an overview of the racetrack fairgrounds as the barracks. Buses and trains took the incarcerees to one of the 10 main camps once they were opened. The journeys to some of the more distant camps in Arkansas took days. During this time, Japanese Americans still had no idea of where they were going. Since window shades were ordered to be drawn down through the entire trip, fears ran rampant, including rumors that they were all going to be taken to an isolated area to be executed. The locations of the 10 main incarceration camps, which the government euphemistically called relocation camps, are shown in this map. There were 2 in California, 2 in Arizona, 2 in Arkansas, and 1 in Idaho, Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. Most were in deserts or swamplands, and all were chosen to be placed in areas far away from the rest of society. Once Japanese Americans arrived at their designated camp, they encountered a stark environment, rows on rows of army barracks that would become their new homes. Arranged in military configuration, each set of barracks comprised a block that had communal facilities for eating, bathing, and laundering. A typical camp held around 8,000 to 10,000 people. These photos show the barracks configuration as well as the extreme isolation of the camp. Even if someone tried to escape, there was nowhere to go. All of the camps were surrounded by armed guards and barbed wire. Some incarcerees initially thought that perhaps the government put them there for their own protection against vigilantes and anti-Japanese violence. But they soon realized that the guards faced their guns inward and that the barbed wire prevented escape, not entry into the camps. The barracks themselves were hastily constructed wood and tar paper structures. Rooms varied from 20 by 8 feet to 20 by 24 feet and were barren except for cots and a coal stove for heat. Unless large in number, entire families lived in a single room. Smaller families and couples as well as singles could be grouped together since a specific number of people was assigned per room. The top photo here shows a barrack room that was recreated at the Manzanar National Historic Site. And the bottom right shows the remnants of a barrack that was moved from one of the camps to a display at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. It gives you a sense of the flimsy construction. As I mentioned, bathing, toileting, laundering, and eating all took place in communal facilities. There was no home space for family meals or personal activities. The photo on the right shows the inside of a communal mess hall. This system created an additional loss of privacy beyond having to live in a single room with your entire family. It also meant standing in lines for everything, as shown in the photo on the left. Once settled, Japanese Americans tried to live their lives as best they could under extraordinary conditions. They eventually attended school, had organized sports, including baseball, as shown here, social clubs, dances, and theater events. Incarcerees, especially the older Japanese immigrants, also made arts and crafts to pass the time. This is a painting made by a Topaz Camp incarceree. And on the right is a brooch made inside the Tule Lake Camp of Northern California. The Tule Lake Camp was surrounded by freshwater wetlands with shells from mollusks. Incarcerees gathered and hand-painted the shells and then used them for jewelry and decorations. There were two main ways through which Japanese Americans eventually left the camps. One way was if the incarceree was US born and had passed a government loyalty registration oath while in camp. These young adults could then apply for leave clearance and were given $25 and a one-way bus or train ticket to attend a college, enlist in the armed forces, or take a job away from the West Coast. While the rest of their families remained in camp, they relocated to cities such as Chicago, Denver, and New York. Most Japanese Americans, however, did not leave until the camps closed. For all but one camp, this occurred at the end of 1945. The incarceration as a historical event might well be seen as having ended when the camps closed. Little was said in public media about what happened, and most Japanese Americans did not talk about it. However, in the mid to late 1970s, grassroots efforts from within the community began to push for recognition that their incarceration had been unjust. In 1980, a formal governmental commission, the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, was formed to evaluate the circumstances surrounding the Japanese American removal. After reviewing hundreds of government documents and hearing testimony from over 750 witnesses, including former incarcerees, as shown in this photo, it concluded that the incarceration was not a military necessity, but was instead a grave injustice that resulted from race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Eventually, in 1988, a congressional act followed recommendations made by the commission and approved providing each incarceration survivor a written apology and a payment of $20,000. 2 years later, the first checks were issued in 1990. Given the passage of time, the awarding of redress, and the view of Japanese Americans as having been a generally economically successful ethnic group after the war, some might think that the historical event was finally finished. However, the incarceration was a significant trauma with a range of long-term psychosocial impacts that continue to reverberate. The word trauma means a wounding that results from a deeply distressing physical or emotional injury, shattering one's sense of safety. The incarceration resulted in individual trauma, but also a group trauma in several ways. First, it was a race-based trauma. Although the US was at war with Germany and Italy, neither German nor Italian Americans were subjected to mass incarceration. Asians were readily identifiable and already viewed negatively as unassimilable outsiders, regardless of citizenship or loyalty. Second, it was a historical trauma. Historical trauma is a term that is used to refer to traumas shared by a group that have impacts that span across generations. And third, the incarceration can be seen as a cultural trauma, an event shared by a group that marks their group consciousness and changes their group members' future identity. These group-level definitions of trauma point to the importance of understanding the incarceration from both an individual and a multi-generational perspective, and to consider the broader question: over time, what have been the long-term impacts of the World War II incarceration for Japanese Americans? Before describing this research, I want to clarify terms I will be using to refer to specific generations of Japanese Americans. Nisei refers to the first generation of immigrant Japanese who came to the United States. Nisei are the second generation in the US, but the first generation to be born in this country. Sansei are the US-born offspring of the Nisei, and Yonsei, the fourth generation, are the offspring of the Sansei. I will focus on the Nisei and Sansei generations, which have asterisks next to them here, starting first by highlighting the traumas of the Nisei who directly experienced the camps, most of whom were teens or young adults at the time. The direct traumas for the Nisei during incarceration were both physical and psychological. Physically, they experienced the dislocation from home, confinement, and the inability to move about freely. And they lived under harsh living conditions that included weather extremes, lack of proper sanitation, incidents of dysentery and food poisoning, and a serious lack of medical care. Psychologically, there was fear about the unknown and where their future was heading. A loss of rights and imprisonment without due process, and the humiliation of having been viewed as suspect and potentially disloyal. Other psychological experiences included being removed from the larger society for an extended period of time, and the stress from the ongoing loss of privacy and no longer having a home or family meals. There were also changes in family role structures in camp. Children tended to eat with friends in the mess halls rather than their families. Fathers no longer had the traditional role of breadwinner, and young adult Nisei were put into positions of greater authority than their Issei elders around official matters, since business in the camp was conducted in English and most immigrant Issei spoke only Japanese. Another unique psychological stress encountered in the camps by the Nisei stemmed from taking a formal loyalty questionnaire that was required of all incarcerees 17 years and older. It included two key questions. One question asked about one's willingness to serve in combat duty for the United States wherever ordered. A second question asked if the respondent swore unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and forswore allegiance or obedience to the Emperor of Japan. The majority of incarcerees saw this as an opportunity to express their loyalty and answered yes, yes to the questions. Some young Nisei men saw this as a chance to show their faithfulness by agreeing to fight for the United States. Nearly 33,000 Japanese Americans, including yes, yes volunteers and draftees whose families remained held behind barbed wire, served in segregated military units during the war. The 442nd All-Nisei Regimental Combat Team went on to become the most decorated unit of World War II. A smaller group of Nisei men, however, believed that American loyalty should be demonstrated by resisting their draft orders until Japanese Americans were released from their unjust incarceration. They were convicted of draft evasion and spent close to 3 years in federal prison. Still, other Japanese Americans were disillusioned and angered by the oath and answered no, no. They were segregated into a more restrictive incarceration camp for the duration of the war. As you can imagine, the differences that emerged around the loyalty questionnaire created stress among Nisei and their family members and friends while in camp. As an aside, I just want to note that one unfortunate long-term consequence was that these divisions endured long after the war, since those who declared no, no or resisted the draft were shunned by the Japanese American community as being unpatriotic. Not surprisingly, negative incarceration impacts continued for the Nisei generation after the war ended and the camps closed. Economically, they had lost wages and earning potential while in camps, lost careers and educational opportunities. Also important was the toll on their physical health. Community clinicians observed a prevalence of psychosomatic disorders, peptic ulcers, and depression in the community post-war. And one study found that former incarcerees had more than a 2 times greater risk of cardiovascular disease than did their non-incarcerated counterparts, a finding that was particularly prevalent amongst the Nisei men. Most Nisei went on to lead successful lives, but that does not mean that they were spared psychological impacts. Some of these are illustrated by comments from Nisei who participated in my research. Especially important was the effect on their sense of ethnic identity. It was clearly bad to be Japanese during the war, and the Nisei continued to face anti-Japanese sentiments from the general public afterwards. One interesting point I want to mention is that although one might have expected the Nisei who were approved to leave camp and work in the Midwest and East, that they would band together for group support as they ventured out into these unknown geographic areas of the country. But the government actually gave them guidelines not to congregate with one another in public. These impacts on ethnic identity, combined with rejection by one's own country and having been imprisoned, contributed to a sense of shame that affected a more basic self-esteem. One of the Nisei interviewees from my research said that after the war, she had, quote, a feeling that there was something wrong with me. Another Nisei expressed it as this: I felt like a second-class citizen, but it really confirmed, it really emphasized that I didn't belong in this country, that my face, my yellow face, made the difference, and I will never belong. The power of the psychological impacts is reflected in the comments of another Nisei gentleman who actually reached out to me just a couple of years ago. He had heard of my research and wanted to share the following. The question I've been wrestling with for a very long time was, being 13 when I was incarcerated with my parents in a concentration camp, I've had issues with being second class, or excuse me for breathing the same air as you, or I'm never going to be as good as I need to be. The coming of age phase usually comes around 12 or 13. My coming of age as an adult was, you are the enemy, you are not wanted, as opposed to a more positive, now you are an adult and have passed into adulthood. Even at this late stage, at 84 years, I continue to wrestle with the odyssey of the camp and how it affected my life. The range of negative impacts are critical to recognize, but it's also important to share the positive impacts that Nisei described. First, living under confinement and hardship for such a long time, they developed bonds of lifelong friendship with other Nisei who were in camp. Even in their late lives, many of these are their closest friends. Some also felt that being forced to move away from the West Coast during resettlement expanded their perspectives beyond the ethnic enclaves where most had lived before the war. And finally, Nisei noted that the incarceration challenges made them resilient when facing subsequent crises and forced them to push forward with a sense of resolve to succeed. The post-war coping of the Nisei was shaped by several factors. First, there was the pragmatic need to focus energy on the pressing task of rebuilding their lives. Keep in mind that many Nisei were in their late teens and early 20s at that time. But Japanese culture also influenced the Nisei's coping. One cultural influence encouraged a sense of acceptance. It is often attributed to the phrase shikata ga nai, which translates into it cannot be helped and discourages dwelling on the past. A second culturally based influence was the Japanese value of gaman, which refers to enduring and persevering through hardship. These pragmatic and cultural coping factors combined with the negative psychological impacts resulted in an overall silence and suppression. The Nisei wanted to move on with their lives and avoided talking about their wartime experience. This, plus a desire to shield children from the burden of knowing what happened, led to a general silence within and outside of the family. Given that historical trauma is defined as having intergenerational impacts, I was particularly interested in exploring how did the incarceration impact the next generation, the Sansei. To explore this, I conducted the Sansei research project and surveyed 490 third-generation Japanese Americans who were the offspring of former incarcerees and interviewed 36 additional Sansei. Because these Sansei were born after the war, their perspectives offered a window into the indirect impacts of incarceration across generations. I also surveyed an additional 105 Sansei who did not have a parent in the camps for comparison. The average age of Sansei at the time of the study was around 32 years. For those whose parents had been incarcerated, the average age for their father while in camp was in their 20s, and for the mothers in their late teens. Their parents were reported to have been in camp an average of 2.5 years. The goal of the project was to explore the range of varied intergenerational impacts. Some of the impacts for the Sansei, such as economic loss, were readily identifiable. Because of the lost income, land, and homes and businesses that impacted their Nisei parents, there were no family inheritance, or in the words of one of my interviewees, no nest eggs to pass on. The Sansei, however, also experienced material losses of family heirlooms and photos that were destroyed when, in a panic immediately following the Pearl Harbor attack, their grandparents and parents burned or buried anything they thought might be seen by the government as evidence of their disloyalty to the United States. Another especially common intergenerational impact was family silence that I mentioned earlier around the Nisei post-war coping. Given its pervasiveness, I'd like to say more about this. Survey responses from the Sansei in my research provided a quantitative window into the extent of this silence. When asked how frequently in their lifetime the topic of incarceration had been talked about in their family, Sansei reported an average between 5 or 10 or more conversations that lasted maybe 5 to 30 minutes. Those who had previously incarcerated parents had more frequent and longer conversations about the camps than Sansei without an incarcerated parent. But the nature of those conversations were really similar across the two groups. When asked about the manner in which their parents had discussed the incarceration with them, less than a third said that the conversation had focused on incarceration as an actual central topic. Instead, the topic was most often discussed incidentally. The silence surrounding the incarceration, however, was more than a complete absence of talk. It also included awkward communications that left the Sansei confused and unsettled. Sansei interviewees provided a richer understanding around the nature of this family silence. Virtually all of them said that their parents rarely talked about camp, but when they did so, the communication was vague and puzzling. Often, incarceration was briefly mentioned as a reference point in time, such as that was before camp or after camp. Most described their parents' overall tone as being matter of fact, with an absence of emotion or bitterness, which to the Sansei seemed at odds with what they perceived to have been such a momentous time of their parents' lives. Parents' communications about the incarceration were also noted as being cryptic and obtuse. Sansei described these communications as being superficial, oblique, left-handed, cryptic, or it occurred through osmosis. Those are actual quotes from what they said. And several mentioned that they were puzzled that their parents shared only positive or funny anecdotes about that time of their life. For example, one Sansei said that their parents described, "Remember when X tried to sneak back into the mess hall line and get an extra helping of food," and then laughed about it. These quotes, I think, really capture the essence of this dynamic well. In this first quote, she says, "You used to hear it all the time and not really know what people meant. I almost got the sense that you really shouldn't ask for some reason because it was painful. Just like you were taught to be polite and not to say when someone is sick. You're not supposed to say, 'What do they have?'" Another described her experience this way. "It's like a skeleton in the closet, like a relative in the family who's retarded or alcoholic. Everyone tiptoes around it, only discussing it when someone else brings it up, like a family scandal." Although the Nisei wanted to move on with life and tried to shield their children from the past, the offspring were still affected. Rather than silence representing the absence of the past, it signaled to the Sansei the presence of something ominous and negative. This sense of foreboding contributed to avoidance on the Sansei's part as well, out of respect, partly for their parents' privacy, as reflected in this one comment. "I don't want to intrude on it. If that's part of a life that he doesn't want to share with me, they won't pursue it." Another mentioned that the avoidance was due to not wanting to dig into the deep emotions. It's just something I don't think we all want to do. I mean, I don't think I want to sit down and cry with my mother and father. As a result, the incarceration silence, shaped both by the Nisei and Sansei avoidance, led to a gap in the Sansei's family history. In addition to silence, a second key intergenerational impact was the accelerated loss of Japanese culture and language. The incarceration emphasized to the Nisei that being Japanese was a serious liability, and this led many of them to raise their children to be American and de-emphasize Japanese culture and language. This is clearly expressed in this quote from one of the interviewees. It affected the way they raised us. They encouraged us to do everything so-called American. We didn't do judo, we didn't do any kendo, we didn't do anything Japanese. While one might expect the loss of adherence to heritage, culture, and language across generations to occur for all immigrant groups, the incarceration accelerated this for Japanese Americans. Another message from Nisei parents was that their children needed to do well in school and work. As a result, Nisei felt an extra pressure to achieve as an extension of their Nisei's efforts to demonstrate worth to broader society. Sansei were also told to avoid doing anything that could draw attention to yourself and to not rock the boat. Keep out of trouble. Clinical psychologist Satsuki Ina summarized it by saying that while the explicit message to the Sansei offspring was to be good, the implicit message was be safe and avoid bringing negative attention to yourself as a Japanese American. Interestingly, for one Sansei in my research project, this message conflicted with the message to achieve. Although his job as a salesperson required him to be assertive and outgoing, his Nisei mother cautioned him against being too assertive. The combination of these expectations had impacts on the Sansei's sense of identity and self-esteem, as described here by one of the interviewees. I think the internment has influenced all our lives, even though we do not talk about it much. Our need to achieve, to prove ourselves American, our feelings of self-worth have all been influenced by the mass rejection we were subjected to. And despite the Nisei's efforts to avoid burdening their children with the camp past, Sansei noted that they still carried an intergenerational sadness and anger for their parents and their relatives, and that their knowledge of what happened in the past weighed on them. An additional emotional weight that Sansei experienced was a sense of vulnerability. One manifestation of this was a lack of confidence in their rights. In my data, offspring of former incarcerees reported that they were significantly less confident about their rights within the US than their Sansei peers whose parents were not in a camp. And 44% of Sansei indicated agreement with the statement that a future internment of Japanese Americans could happen again if war is declared against Japan. Interview comments also revealed a lack of confidence extending to the US government more generally. One said, "The greatest effect of the camps has had on me is a distrust of the federal government." And another shared this: "It's affected her sense of patriotism, affecting my whole feeling about this country. I no longer stand up at baseball games and say the Pledge of Allegiance. I'm real critical of this government. I mean, I care about the people, but I don't feel the sense of, I love my country and I love my flag. It's really because of what happened to my parents and grandparents." Although these comments illustrate negative impacts around vulnerability, it's important to note that the gap between US democratic ideals and the incarceration also sparked other Sansei toward actions to address the wrongdoing. Sansei activists who were inspired by what they had learned from ethnic studies classes and the civil rights movement played a critical role in the redress movement that I mentioned earlier. Overall, the majority of Sansei coped successfully as the children of Nisei incarcerees. However, I do want to mention that concerning levels of drug abuse, suicide, and gang activities in the 1960s and 70s occurred amongst a subgroup of Sansei in Southern California. and have been considered by Japanese Americans as reflecting consequences for those who could not or did not live up to their Nisei parents' post-war expectations. Additional intergenerational impacts emerged through the research. One was the honoring of one's parents by making a particular educational or career choice to complete the goal that a parent was unable to attain after being derailed by the camps. This included attending a specific college or getting a particular degree. Other Sansei pursued law or social activism based on a desire to address the injustices similar to those encountered by their parents. Yet another interesting way of honoring parents emerged when they expressed that they followed their parents' habits. Specifically, one Sansei noted that after the war, his father tried to be as American as possible and shunned all products made in Japan. His father's cars were always Chevys. Nearly 50 years later, the Sansei's son said that he also only buys Chevys in recognition of his father's preferences and what they represented. Another interviewee example of honoring one's parents' camp experience was shared by this Sansei. He said, in camp, Dad said they didn't get ketchup very often, so now he puts ketchup on potatoes, eggs, and meats. I also use ketchup on my eggs, potatoes, and meats because of it. Sansei were also impacted by the loss of their parent. For some, this was loss due to an early death. Among the Sansei survey respondents who reported that their fathers had died early before the age of 60, twice as many had fathers who had been in a camp compared to those whose fathers were not incarcerated. But other incarcerees also reported the psychological loss of a parent whose life had been thwarted. One described, he's a gardener since the war. He's never really used his artistic talent. He was a fine artist, and so that part is sad. He could have been a much more influential person, a much more self-satisfied person. My father was never proud to be a gardener. As a result, we never really talked about what he did for a living. As with the Nisei, the Sansei were able to identify positive impacts. The most common was noting that they saw their parents as role models of resilience and drew inspiration from what they had endured and survived. For other Sansei, there was a sobering awareness that their own existence is linked to the incarcerations, since their parents met in a camp. Finally, interviews revealed that there have been some additional ongoing cross-generational impacts related to stimuli that elicit strong emotional reactions around incarceration. This process is called symbolic reactivation, when something associated with a trauma triggers an immediate emotional response. For Japanese Americans, these stimuli can be specific dates. Not surprisingly, December 7th is one of these. The media always notes Pearl Harbor on this date, usually with the words of President Roosevelt, saying that December 7th is a day that will live in infamy. This was indeed a watershed moment in US history for all Americans, and particularly for those who lost loved ones during the attack and subsequent war. For Japanese Americans, however, it can be an annual reminder of the incarceration. February 19th is another significant date for Japanese Americans. This is the date when the Executive Order 9066 was issued. Today, Japanese American communities across the country hold annual Day of Remembrance activities around February 19th to commemorate the significance of what happened. Sansei also revealed that certain foods could create unexpected triggers while interacting with their parents. Typically, these were instances where a Nisei parent had surprisingly abrupt and negative responses to something that had seemed positive or neutral to their Sansei offspring. In one example, a Sansei described that she was a young girl and thrilled to have successfully made a Jell-O dish from a mold, like in this picture. She proudly presented it to her Nisei father. But rather than a positive response, all he said was, "Ugh, I hate Jell-O. It reminds me of camp." She was, of course, upset by this interaction and knew from then on that Jell-O was an emotional trigger for her dad. The slide shows some of the specific foods that Sansei mentioned as negative camp-related foods. Apple butter was mentioned most often. Certain places might also elicit emotional reactions. This is a slide of Santa Anita Racetrack located in Southern California. As I mentioned earlier, Santa Anita was used to confine Japanese Americans for several months before they were sent to the more permanent camps. Because many Nisei lived in Los Angeles after the war, and Santa Anita has continued to be in use, seeing or hearing about the racetrack could elicit memories of the past. The pervasive family silence around the camps, however, meant that a Sansei daughter or son might not know the significance of such specific incarceration-related locations. One of the Sansei interviewees described how she always loved horses when she was a little girl. Because her family lived in Southern California, she repeatedly asked her mother to take her to see the racehorses at Santa Anita. Her mother refused repeatedly until finally she gave in. Once they arrived, the daughter asked to go on a tour of the stable area, and here is what she described. We went, and my mother told me, "You see that stall over there? That's number 5 Seabiscuit Lane. We lived in that stall." The daughter went on to say, "I was so upset, I was so angry, because on the one hand, there were all these beautiful horses, and it was a beautiful facility. But for a family, it was just so awful." My mother told us when we got there, there was horse manure on the floor. Santa Anita, as a place which had originally seemed so positive and exciting to the daughter, was now associated with her mother's painful past. I also have a brief personal story related to the significance of place as associated to the camps. Those of you familiar with the U of M campus might recognize this building. This is a photo of the entrance to West Quad dorm, taken from the Thompson Street side. You're probably wondering, what has this got to do with the incarceration? So here's the connection. About a year after I first moved to Ann Arbor to take a faculty position here at the university, my parents came to visit from California. While they were here, my dad asked what building my office was in. I wondered why he was so interested in this specific piece of information, but went ahead and told him that the building was West Quad. At that time, the various specialties of psychology were spread out across several buildings on campus, and clinical psychology, my area, was housed in West Quad. When my dad heard me say West Quad, he started to laugh. This was totally confusing to me since he hadn't even seen the building or my office. He then explained that he used to work in the kitchen at the bottom of West Quad during the war. Now I was even more confused. What I learned was that after he was cleared by the government and deemed loyal, he took a one-way train trip out of the Topaz camp to Ann Arbor to work as a pot washer in the dorm basement, which at the time was being used to house naval recruits. I had known that my parents were incarcerated during the war, but this was the first time I'd heard that my father had ever been to Ann Arbor or that he had moved out of camp to work in Michigan. Like most Nisei, he had kept silent about his incarceration-related experiences. Another example of that intergenerational silence. Learning about this was both surprising and humbling. Here I was, working as a professor in the same building where some 50 years earlier, my father had washed pots. To summarize a few points, the World War II Japanese American incarceration experience represents an historical, racial, and cultural form of trauma. The psychosocial impacts of this event for Japanese Americans have extended far beyond the closing of the camps and the end of the war. And these impacts have emerged in a range of ways that span across generations, affecting the lives of those born after this event. At the beginning of this talk, I said that 2 words that summarize its theme are history matters. Hopefully, the presentation has highlighted this theme, and in the process, shown how research on historical traumas remind us that governmental policies can have long-term psychosocial consequences for those directly affected as well as their offspring. just want to close by acknowledging all of these sources that have helped support my research on the Japanese American incarceration over the years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nagata. That was really, truly excellent, really, really powerful. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how you went about conducting this research. And obviously it must be very hard. I would think it'd be challenging to find these families. You found many families. I was wondering if you just talk about how you went about doing finding families and how you went about interviewing them or talking with them.
Sure. Yes, it was a challenge. One of the issues is that the research sequence which I did the research was starting first with studying the Sansei, and then I also did a separate project studying the Nisei. The problem in gathering data on the Sansei generation is because you cannot go by a Japanese surname because people have outmarried and so they may not have a Japanese surname. So what I relied on were mailing lists that were generated from largely the Japanese American Citizens League, which is a group that has chapters all over the country where there's a sizable population of Japanese Americans. And then I had to rely on the chapter heads to be able to distribute my requests for participants and provide names of potential people who they knew were third generation. So there was a logistic difficulty in doing that. And then the Japanese American Citizens League and also the Young Buddhist Association also helped to provide potential participants. For the Nisei was also tricky. I had originally hoped for that study to gather names from the organization that kept records of everyone who had been in the camps. But that information was restricted to the federal level. And so they were not able to share that list of names as well. So for the Nisei, the second generation, I was able to use rosters from camp reunion organizations. So people may not know, but they, over the years, had groups that were reunion organizations for each of the specific camps. And so by contacting the heads of those organizations, I was able to get Nisei participants.
Wow. Okay. And then how did you conduct the interviews? Did you meet the families in person or use telephone, or how'd that work?
So for the interviews, I was able to do those in person. So I found people who were willing to do that. And most of these were done, as you might expect, in California, where the most sizable group of Japanese Americans were still living. So those were done in person. I also did in-depth interviews with Nisei, and those I did by telephone. And there's an interesting part to that as well. I had thought that it would be better to do those interviews in person for obvious reasons. But as it turned out, the Nisei were more comfortable speaking on the phone than being face-to-face. And I think that makes sense in terms of having to revisit aspects of their life that were at times very unpleasant and memories that they had not really wanted to dig into. It actually helped to do it by telephone and have that extra kind of distance, if you will, that allowed them to participate.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Could you talk a bit about the current research you're doing along these lines?
Sure. My current research project is I'm extending this program of study that I've been doing to the next generation still. So I've been talking about the Sansei. When they were surveyed and interviewed, they were on average in their 30s. Their children, the Yonsei, fourth generation, are now at about that same age stage. So in their 20s to late 30s or so. So I'm doing a Yonsei project where I am surveying fourth generation Japanese Americans who have had a grandparent who was in the camps. So this is taking it another level out. This is really interesting because a good percentage of the fourth generation are biracial or bi-ethnic. And so it's an interesting question to think about how the ramifications of the incarceration are extending into this group because they are living in a very different space and time than the Sansei, for example. All of the Sansei in my study were Japanese American. They were not of mixed ethnic or cultural background. So that'll be different. The other thing that's really different about this Yonsei study that I'm doing now is technology has obviously changed as well in the meantime. So I'm doing it by a Qualtrics, an online survey that has opportunities for open-ended discussion at the end as well. But what's really hugely different is I've been able to get social media and Japanese American groups to distribute the link, and I've had a huge response rate already. So it's been pretty eye-opening.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's great. Okay, and then the last question has to do with this research, this form of research you're doing, where these in-depth interviews, or also called qualitative research. A lot of research that we hear about nowadays is looking at big data, like looking at Facebook data, looking at data from Instagram, and looking at thousands of people, but just little bits about each individual. I was wondering how you see the contribution of this type of in-depth research currently and in the future.
Sure. I think that the value in doing this kind of qualitative research is it really opens up material that you might not have expected in advance. So if you do a sort of structured survey or you have measures in advance, you're already defining kind of the realm of questions that you'll get answers to. When it's an interview, for example, as in the case of these projects, the open-endedness means that there's room for new things to emerge. So for example, when I went into the interviews and studying the Sansei, I had no idea that there were people who had these food stories or stories about these places or these weird interactions with their parents. And yet it was coming up again and again. When I did the survey, I had no question about that because I had no idea that that was a thing to be looking at. So I think qualitative and digging deep into people's life experiences really enriches the range of what you can understand about a given phenomena.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. I'm sure like you have over 400 families and these in-depth interviews. I'm sure that into itself is just a massive amount of data that I'm sure took years to go through. Is that right? And derive themes from them.
Right. So the main part of the 490 were actually more quantitative data. So looking at the nature of communication and things like that. But definitely qualitative work is not for the faint-hearted in terms of extracting themes and trying to distill it.
Right. Yeah. Oh, great. Well, thank you so much for your time. This is really incredibly valuable talk to hear. I very much appreciate it. All right.
Well, thank you.